The Missing Christmas Letter. Welcome to Mystery Crackers. I'm Michael, your host for tonight's Miss Marple mystery. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know what's something you've always been curious about. A small habit people have, a place you've never been, or even a mystery that's stayed with you for years. Share it with us in the comments. I truly enjoy reading your thoughts. Now then, settle in, and let's begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The snow in St. Mary Mead had fallen in perfect soft layers overnight, wrapping every hedge, rooftop, and privet gate in a crisp white stillness. By morning, the village looked as though it had been tucked inside a Christmas card, a fact not lost on the local women gathered at the vicarage for the annual carol tea. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Winifred Clement, had outdone herself as usual. Shortbread shaped like angels, spiced fruit cake dotted with glacé cherries, and a pot of Christmas punch that glowed faintly pink in the afternoon light. The drawing-room hummed with polite laughter, china clinks, and the occasional false note from the piano, where Miss Hartley attempted a rendition of God Rest Ye Merry, gentlemen with more enthusiasm than skill. In the corner, wrapped in a shawl of pale blue wool and quietly sipping her tea, sat Miss Marple. She did not speak much, nor interrupt the flow of gossip that swirled around her. She had no need to. Her pale blue eyes took in the assembled women, observing the stiffness in a hostess's smile, the flicker of irritation in a daughter's eyes, the barely suppressed smirk at someone else's misfortune. Human nature, she often said, was terribly unoriginal. Across the room, Mrs. Isabel Larkspur leaned in to whisper something behind her gloved hand to Mrs. Henshaw. Miss Marple noted the twitch in Mrs. Henshaw's eye before she responded. Something had been said that unsettled her. "Oh, Winifred," Mrs. Larkspur called in a more audible voice, "your drawing-room looks especially charming this year. Has the vicar added the sprigs of rosemary above the mantel himself?" Winifred, whose hands were floured from a recent biscuit rescue in the kitchen, smiled tightly. "He insisted. Claims rosemary is for remembrance." "Rather gloomy for Christmas," muttered Miss Hartley, just loud enough to be heard. "As if we needed more of that." "No one said anything of Major Larkspur this year," someone murmured from the piano. At this, the air in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple looked down at her teacup, then up at Isabel Larkspur, whose smile froze slightly. "It's been 5 years," Winifred said, a touch too brightly, "and this season is for cheer, not dwelling on sad things." "I'm not sad," Isabel replied at once too swiftly. "Reginald always hated carols. Dull man." The words hung in the air longer than necessary. Miss Marple watched as Isabel folded her napkin with precise fingers. That was the second time today she had made a jab at her late husband. Before another awkward silence could settle, young Timothy Purvis from the post office arrived at the door with a small canvas sack. "Afternoon, ladies," he chirped. "Post from the morning train. Miss Marple, one for you, Scotland, I believe, and one for Mrs. Larkspur." Isabel accepted hers without ceremony, turning it over with a frown. "No return address." Odd Winifred beamed. "Oh, I do hope someone remembered my invitation letters." Miss Marple slid her letter into her handbag, smiling politely at Timothy. The boy left in a flurry of snowflakes and boot marks. As tea was cleared and the carols resumed, Isabel Larkspur stood up. "Excuse me, I've just remembered something. I shan't be long." Miss Marple's eyes followed her discreetly. Isabel did not head toward her coat or the stairs, but instead slipped through the back hall, toward the vicar's study. Odd, thought Miss Marple, most peculiar. By the next morning, the village hummed with a whisper. Isabel Larkspur was dead. She had been found in her drawing-room at Larkspur House by her maid, seated upright in her chair, still wearing the same pine-green velvet from the Carol tea. The fireplace had gone out sometime during the night, and the doctor said it was the cold, or perhaps her heart. She had been quite strained since Major Larkspur's accident those years ago. Miss Marple listened carefully as Winifred Clement recounted the discovery over a cup of tea the following afternoon. She had a letter in her lap, Jane. But the oddest thing is, it was blank, the envelope too. She told me yesterday at tea she'd received something strange. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Blank, you say? Quite. I do wonder if it was some sort of prank. Of course, the doctor said her heart simply stopped, but still, she seemed so full of energy when she left. Miss Marple glanced out the vicarage window, where the snow had begun to fall again, slower this time. Sometimes, Winifred, people don't die simply because of what's in their hearts, but because of what weighs on them. Winifred frowned. You don't think foul play? I think, said Miss Marple quietly, that if one were to kill someone gently, without violence or suspicion, then Christmas would offer many convenient disguises. Chapter 2. Larkspur House had always stood apart from the rest of St. Mary Mead, not by grandeur, but by distance. A low, ivy-covered manor tucked behind a line of yews. It bore an atmosphere of quiet disdain, as if it had never quite accepted the passage of time, or the people who dared speak too freely within it. The morning after Mrs. Larkspur's death, a thin fog clung to the village lanes. The snow had crusted over, brittle underfoot, and a hush hung in the air, not born of reverence, but caution. Miss Marple, bundled in her pale grey coat, walked slowly down Church Lane. She was not heading to Larkspur House, not yet. She was headed to the post office. Inside, Timothy Purvis was sorting envelopes with the manic energy of someone trying to outrun both gossip and responsibility. He glanced up as the bell tinkled. Morning, Miss Marple. Terrible news about Mrs. Larkspur, eh? Very, said Miss Marple gently. She seemed quite lively at the Carol tea, did she not? Sharp as ever, if you ask me, he replied, pushing a parcel aside. Even scolded me yesterday for not wearing gloves. How thoughtful of her, said Miss Marple, adjusting her mittens. Tell me, Timothy, the letter she received, did you notice anything peculiar about it? Timothy paused. Now that you mention it, I didn't really. It had no return address, but that's not unheard of. No handwriting you recognized. He shook his head. Plain, almost too plain. Looked like one of those machine-written ones, like the type you'd get in bank statements. Miss Marple nodded, thanked him, and turned to go. Oh, Miss Marple, Timothy called after her. There was a smell to it. A smell? He scratched his chin. Like cinnamon, or cloves. Something warm and sweet. Thought it was my lunch at first, but now seems odd, doesn't it? Indeed, she said softly, very odd. By midday, the village had begun to stir with rumour. At the greengrocer's, 2 elderly women whispered about arsenic in the tea. At the butcher's, someone mentioned a family curse. At the vicarage, Winifred Clement had received a call from Isabel's cousin in Tunbridge Wells. She's asking after Reginald's papers, Winifred told Miss Marple over lunch. Said there were unresolved things between them. Property, perhaps. Miss Marple said, breaking her scorn. And Isabel had no children, did she? None at all. Then everything would have reverted to Reginald's next of kin. Winifred blinked. Unless she changed her will. But that would have been years ago. Miss Marple made no comment. That afternoon, Constable Reeves appeared at Larkspur House with a solemn face and too much starch in his collar. Miss Marple, already at the gate on the pretence of returning a borrowed book, caught his eye. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "didn't expect to see you here. I was hoping to drop off the Forsyte Saga. Isabel borrowed it before the summer. I'm sure her maid will want to return it to the lending circle." He hesitated. "I suppose that's all right, but I should warn you, we're keeping the room as she left it." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I won't touch a thing." Inside, the drawing-room had been left undisturbed. The hearth was still cold. A single teacup rested on a side table. The dregs congealed into a faint brown stain. The envelope was gone, but Miss Marple's eyes moved carefully over the surroundings. Why, her armchair cushions were slightly compressed. 2 indentations, not one. She turned. Did Mrs. Larkspur have a visitor that evening? "Not that we know of," Reeves replied. "The maid says she went straight to bed after coming home from the vicarage." "And yet," Miss Marple tapped the second cushion, "either she shifted seats, or someone else sat here." Reeves frowned. "You think someone visited her?" "I think someone came to collect something, or to make sure it wasn't passed on." "Passed on?" Miss Marple said nothing more. Later that evening, as the sun vanished behind thick grey clouds, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace with a single candle lit. Her fingers rested gently on the letter she'd received the previous day, the one from Scotland. She had not yet opened it. Instead, she opened the Forsyte Saga, but not to read it. Tucked within its pages was a tiny slip of paper. It read, "December 18th. Tell no one, especially Isabel." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the paper smelled faintly of something festive. Cloves, perhaps, or a mulled drink long since gone cold. Miss Marple exhaled quietly and refolded the note. There was more to this than a fainting heart and a blank envelope. The timing was too precise, the wording too deliberate. Someone had feared Isabel Larkspur would speak, and someone had ensured she never would. Chapter 3. The frost was sharp on the hedges the next morning, brittle enough to crack beneath a fingertip. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thick tweed coat, paused briefly at the gate of Larkspur House once more, not to enter this time, but to observe. From within, she could hear muffled voices, Constable Reeves again, and a second man with a deeper tone. Perhaps Inspector Crail from Much Benham. The presence of outside authority suggested the whispers were growing teeth. She moved on slowly toward her true destination, the home of Miss Evelyn Hartley. The music tutor was unmarried, sharp-nosed and habitually nosy, but unlike most of the village, she wrapped her curiosity in the veneer of genteel indifference. Miss Marple had always found her oddly useful. Miss Hartley opened the door, still clutching a lace duster. "Jane, I wasn't expecting callers." "I won't stay," Miss Marple said warmly. "Only wanted to return your biscuit tin. You left it at the vicarage last week." Miss Hartley narrowed her eyes at it. "So I did. Come in for a moment, won't you?" Miss Marple stepped inside. They settled near the hearth, which was lit but smouldering, half heat, half ashes. Miss Hartley, never one to waste coal, Terrible business about Isabel, she said, settling her skirts. But really not so shocking. No. She always had a dramatic streak, Evelyn sniffed. Some people call it grief, but I call it indulgence. Reginald died years ago, and she never quite forgave the world for it. You were close once. Miss Hartley looked away. That was before she became someone else entirely. Miss Marple waited. She used to say things, Miss Hartley muttered. Hints, you know, about what Reginald had been involved in. Said someone had wanted him gone long before that car accident. Miss Marple set her cup down. How curious. She fancied herself the heroine of a Gothic romance, Evelyn said, rising to poke the fire. She wrote endless letters about it, diaries too. I wouldn't be surprised if she kept records. Records. Isabel believed in legacy. Always said secrets shouldn't die with the dead. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the fire. And yet some might prefer that they do. By midday, Inspector Crail had requested a word with Miss Marple. She found him at the vicarage, seated in the Clements' parlour with a steaming cup and a look of irritation. Miss Marple, he said without preamble. You have a reputation for insight. I suppose that's why Constable Reeves suggested I speak with you. She nodded graciously. Inspector, I don't wish to speculate on village gossip, he began, but it seems Mrs. Larkspur's death may warrant closer attention. Oh? Crail leaned forward. A letter was recovered from her writing desk, torn but legible in parts. It wasn't the blank one. This one had been started and then abandoned. He pulled a notepad from his coat. I've held it for too long, it begins. I know the truth about the Major's final days. If anyone should read this, no, I never meant... And then it stops. No signature. But the paper matches the envelope she was found with. Miss Marple remained quiet for a moment. Then, and the ink. Still wet at the time of death, Crail confirmed. She was writing it within minutes of... Well, and the teacup? Crail blinked. What about it? There was an ink stain on the rim, Miss Marple said mildly. And yet the letter was only half written. Suggests she sipped her tea while writing, not before or after. Crail stared at her. She drank the tea, then died mid-thought, she added, which makes one wonder, what was in the tea? That afternoon, word of the ink-stained cup had reached even the quietest corners of St. Mary Mead. Miss Hartley was seen again at the grocer's, muttering about dramatic poisonings, while Mrs. Henshaw went unusually silent when asked about her long-standing bridge partner. Miss Marple, meanwhile, visited the only place in the village where truths had a habit of slipping out between slices of Battenberg, the Rose Petal Tea Room, owned by young Millie Parkins and frequented by every tongue in the county. She ordered gingerbread and sat quietly, listening. Apparently it was some sort of foreign tea, whispered Mrs. Blackwell, a widow with too much time and a sharp eye. One of those expensive kinds Isabel liked to order from London. Exotic stuff. Smelled like cloves. Millie leaned in. She asked me about cinnamon infusions last week. Wanted to know if you could brew it with almond extract. Almond? Gasped Mrs. Blackwell. Cyanide smells like almonds. Millie flushed. I didn't mean that. Just something sweet. Miss Marple took a slow sip of her own tea, which had no almond, cinnamon, or hint of poison. But the word hung there in the air all the same. That evening, alone again at home, she examined the torn letter given to her by Inspector Crail. The edges were uneven. A right-handed tear hurried, perhaps out of fear. The handwriting was undeniably Isabel's. But something troubled Miss Marple. A phrase stood out. I never meant it was too theatrical, too final. Not the words of someone confessing, the words of someone about to be silenced. She turned again to the slip of paper found in the Forsyte saga. December 18th. Tell no one, especially Isabel. And then it came to her. Not the content, but the contradiction. Why would someone send her a warning not to trust Isabel, if Isabel had been the one in danger? Unless the letter wasn't meant for Miss Marple at all. Chapter 4. The snow had hardened into a crisp sheen by the time Miss Marple made her way to the rectory for supper. The streets of St. Mary Mead were quieter now, not from reverence, but from hesitation. People avoided lingering at doorsteps. Conversations were cut short the moment another figure drew near. Death in the village always caused ripples, but a death that began to look like murder. That stirred undercurrents no one dared name aloud. Winifred Clement greeted Miss Marple with uncharacteristic weariness. You've heard the latest, I expect. About the inspector finding ink in the tea? Yes, though I believe there's more in the pot than just that. Winifred smiled faintly at the pun, but didn't press. They dined simply, potted shrimp and brown bread, and afterward sat by the fire, where Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, spoke softly. Did Isabel ever mention her husband's cousin to you? Winifred blinked. Cousin, from Tunbridge Wells. Oh, Miss Frances Larkspur, a cold sort. Turned up only after Reginald died, if I remember. Isabel didn't trust her. Did she say why? Something to do with property. Frances wanted to invest the estate, make it yield something. Isabel refused. She liked her independence. Miss Marple nodded, winding the yarn delicately around her finger. Frances has come back, you know. She called after the funeral, asked whether there was a will. And was there? Winifred hesitated. Isabel always said she had one, but none has turned up. Not yet. Curious, isn't it? Murmured Miss Marple. How some documents vanish just when they're needed most. The next morning brought a visit from Inspector Crail. He found Miss Marple in her garden, clipping the frost-bitten edges off her winter. Pansies. May I trouble you, Miss Marple? Of course, Inspector, if you don't mind cold feet. He stood awkwardly by the iron gate. We received word from the family solicitor. No will has been found in Isabel's personal safe. It appears it hasn't been opened in years. Miss Marple glanced up. Was it locked? Oddly, no. Key in the drawer. Contents: 3 brooches, old letters, a photograph album, and a bundle of dried violets. Nothing official? Not a scrap. Then the estate will pass to the next of kin by default, she said softly. Precisely, Miss Frances Larkspur. Miss Marple returned her shears to the basket. I believe it's time I visited Larkspur House again. Frances Larkspur was a woman carved from cold stone and strict posture. Her grey hair was tightly coiled, her expression tighter still. She received Miss Marple in the front parlour, an austere room of heavy curtains and ticking clocks. Miss Marple, she said without warmth, I expected a clergyman, not a village busybody. I assure you, Miss Larkspur, I have no designs on your business, Miss Marple said sweetly, only on the truth. Frances raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a threat. Only to those who've hidden it. A thin pause. Frances crossed her legs. I came only to settle what remains. I barely knew Isabel. Reginald and I were raised together, that's all. And yet you called the vicarage asking after her documents before she was buried. Frances's smile didn't reach her eyes. Efficiency, Miss Marple. Some of us find mourning more bearable when things are orderly. Did you know she was writing a letter before she died? No. Her tone sharpened. A letter that suggested she had held something back about her husband's death. That sounds like dramatics. Isabel always had a flair for the theatrical. Even so, someone wanted her quiet. Frances stood abruptly. "If you've come to accuse me, not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "I've come to remind you that the truth rarely stays buried, especially in a village where people remember which way the wind blew 5 Christmases ago." Frances said nothing. As Miss Marple left, she noticed a letter opener on the hall table. Silver, monogrammed. The edge was stained with something dark. Ink or something else? That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and opened the letter from Scotland at last. It wasn't addressed to her. In fact, the name on the inside page, Isabel Larkspur, had been crossed out in haste. The letter was from a Miss Anna Duncombe, a former lady's maid now residing in Edinburgh. It spoke of that terrible night on the cliffs, of Reginald's fall, and of a conversation she'd overheard between Isabel and a woman with a northern voice. "He didn't slip," the letter read. "She said she knew. Said if anyone ever found out. The rest was torn." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. So Isabel did know something. And someone had been afraid she'd talk. Or perhaps that she already had. At dusk, Miss Marple met with Inspector Crail once more, this time beside the Larkspur family crypt, where Isabel's name had only just been carved into the stone. "She knew something," Miss Marple said softly, "and someone knew she was about to say it." "Do you think Frances did it?" "I think Frances wanted silence, but I do not believe she sent the tea." "Then who?" Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the churchyard trees, their bare limbs trembling in the cold. "There's one thing that bothers me," she said. "The letter Anna Duncombe sent was never meant for me, but it arrived in my hands. That means someone intervened. Someone intercepted it and redirected it." Crail frowned. "But why give it to you instead of destroying it?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Because someone wanted me involved. Someone wanted me to see what Isabel might have done. Or said, perhaps even to protect someone else." Crail stared at her. "You think it's all misdirection?" Miss Marple nodded once. "We're being led through the snow by carefully placed footprints, but soon the real path will show itself, just as the thaw reveals what's buried beneath her." Chapter 5. The first thaw came suddenly. By the 5th morning after Isabel Larkspur's death, the frost had loosened its grip on St. Mary Mead. Snow slid from rooftops in quiet sheets. Icicles dripped onto stone paths. Beneath the hedgerows, soil darkened, exposed once more to the weight of things buried. Miss Marple spent that morning indoors, staring thoughtfully at the letter from Anna Duncombe. The final line still whispered in her mind. He didn't slip. She knew. But who was she? Isabel or someone else? The distinction mattered now more than ever. In the early afternoon, a soft knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Millie Parkins from the tea-room. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes unusually wide. "Miss Marple, I've something strange to show you, but I didn't know who else to tell." "Come in, dear. Sit down." Millie clasped a small, pale envelope between her gloved fingers. "I clean Mrs. Larkspur's tea-room table on Mondays. She always left a tip under the saucer. Only this time I found this." She handed it over. Miss Marple turned the envelope gently. There was no address, only a name written in narrow masculine print, Reggie. Inside was a single pressed violet, dry and crumbling, and a torn fragment of music manuscript penciled with notes and the words "On the Cliffs." "Do you know what it means?" Milly asked nervously. Miss Marple closed the envelope. "Yes and no." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the church hall, where Evelyn Hartley was leading a choir rehearsal for the Christmas Eve service. The voices of half a dozen elderly sopranos rang out in shaky harmony as she arrived. Evelyn saw her at the back and dismissed the choir with a wave. "You've come to ask about the music, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You're still very sharp, Evelyn." The music tutor pulled her cardigan tighter. "I recognized the phrase when I saw it. On the Cliffs. It's not just a song title. It was the name of a private composition Reginald wrote, years ago, before he died. You taught him? For a time. Piano. He was no genius, but he loved composing. That particular piece was written after an argument with Isabel. She hated that he still wrote music. It reminded her of his first wife." "His first wife?" "Oh, yes," Evelyn said quietly. "Didn't you know? Reginald was married before Isabel. She died young, barely 30, fell ill. Some said he never got over her." Miss Marple paused. "Was Isabel jealous?" "Furiously. She used to say the music kept her ghost in the house." Back at Larkspur House, Inspector Crail was reviewing a new batch of correspondence found tucked inside the back of the late Isabel's wardrobe. Among it was a letter addressed to RDL, Reginald Desmond Larkspur, postmarked 3 days before his death. "You said you'd come clean," it read. "If you don't tell her, I will. I won't be part of this any more. We buried the truth too long, Reggie. It's rotting beneath us." The signature was a simple A. Crail frowned. "Do you suppose this connects to the Duncombe woman?" Miss Marple shook her head. Number Miss Duncombe was a maid, and this handwriting is far too confident. This letter was written by someone who knew him closely, possibly even as an equal. She tapped the edge of the page. "Look again at the language. Come clean." "We buried the truth. It suggests joint guilt." "You think Reginald and someone else covered something up?" "I think whatever they buried has begun to surface." That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the churchyard. Alone, she stood before the Larkspur headstones, 3 in a line. First Annette Larkspur, beloved wife of Reginald, 1898 to 1929. Second, Reginald Desmond Larkspur, Major, 1892 to 1937. Third, a fresh stone, Isabel Clare Larkspur, 1900 to 1952. She looked long at the first. Annette, the first wife, forgotten by most. But Miss Marple had not forgotten Evelyn's words. She fell ill. Was it illness, or something more? She bent low and brushed a crust of snow from Annette's stone. Beneath it, a faint indentation. Someone had recently laid flowers here, not roses, violets. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She stood slowly and walked away, her footsteps light, but her mind churning. The next day brought new complications. Milly Parkins arrived again, this time at the vicarage, pale and out of breath. "They've broken into the tea-room," she whispered to Winifred, Clement. "Nothing taken, but the drawer where I kept that envelope. It was left open." Winifred called for Miss Marple immediately. "I didn't tell anyone," Milly insisted, "only you." Miss Marple placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "That's why it matters." Someone had known Milly had the envelope, and someone had tried to retrieve it. But they hadn't taken it, because Miss Marple already had. That afternoon she returned to the letter once again, the envelope marked Reggie, the violet, the music. She laid it beside Anna Duncombe's torn confession and the letter from the mysterious A. Then she turned them over. The paper stock matched. All three. All from the same source. All from someone who had known Reginald intimately, had communicated with him secretly, and who had reason to remain hidden long after his death. She pressed her fingers against her temples. 3 deaths, 1 buried truth. And a Christmas letter meant for someone else entirely. The question was no longer what happened on those cliffs. It was who else knew it, and why, after 15 years, they had decided now was the time to kill. Chapter 6. The cold returned that morning, not with snow, but with a dry, brittle wind that swept clean through St. Mary Mead, rattling the church windows and lifting flakes of paper from the post office bulletin board. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, waiting for the second post. She received 2 envelopes, one from her niece in Bournemouth, and another curiously unmarked, except for the delicate handwriting that simply read, "To be opened in private." She waited until she was indoors, settled into her wing-back chair with the fire gently crackling, before carefully slicing it open. Inside was a single sheet of ivory paper. No signature, no address, just 6 handwritten words. Ask Evelyn Hartley about Annette Larkspur. Miss Marple did not need prompting twice. She found Miss Hartley in the library, arranging hymn sheets and muttering to herself about flat tenors and lost altos. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you have a moment." Miss Hartley looked up, startled. "Of course. I hope nothing's wrong." "That rather depends. I'd like to ask you about Annette Larkspur." The music tutor stiffened. "That's a name I haven't heard in years." Miss Marple waited. "She was radiant," Evelyn said finally, "a quiet kind of beauty. Almost too gentle for this world. Reginald adored her." "And you knew her well?" "I was her piano teacher. She took lessons every Tuesday morning. Her hands were delicate, but her tempo was always true." Miss Marple nodded. "And her health? Was she truly ill?" Evelyn hesitated. "She faded, that's what people said. She began having dizzy spells, then stomach pains. Reginald hired a nurse to help. His cousin, I believe." "Frances?" No, someone else. A distant cousin, only around a short time. Then one morning, Annette didn't wake up." Miss Marple watched Evelyn's face carefully. "You never believed it was natural, did you?" Evelyn looked down. "No," she whispered, "I never did." Miss Marple left the library with a troubling weight pressing at her thoughts. If Annette had not died naturally, and if Reginald had known something, then perhaps his own fall on the cliffs had not been an accident either. Which meant Isabel had been left behind with a truth she dared not speak. Until, of course, she did. Just once, and died for it. By midday, Inspector Crail had summoned Miss Marple to Larkspur House again. This time she was led not to the parlour, but to the attic. "We found a trunk behind the false panel," he explained. "Old journals, correspondence, sheet music, and this." He handed her a faded photograph. Reginald and a woman, standing in front of a fireplace, but it wasn't Isabel. It was Annette. "You see the background?" Crail asked. Miss Marple looked more closely. The fireplace wasn't from Larkspur House. The mantel was carved with musical notes. "The studio," she murmured. "His composing room." Crail nodded. "In the journal, there's mention of a final piece he was working on, called The Silence of Snow. He never finished it." Miss Marple turned the photo over. In neat pencil, to her, "You were right. I can't protect you forever. Forgive me." She stared at it for a long moment. Not Anna Duncombe, not Annette, someone else. That evening, she paid a quiet visit to Francis Larkspur. They sat stiffly in the drawing-room, fire low, tea untouched. "I understand you are not the only cousin who worked with the family," Miss Marple said casually. "There was another, briefly, during Annette's illness." Francis didn't blink. "Yes, Agatha. We were close once. She had a talent for making people believe she was harmless. Where is she now?" "Dead," Francis said shortly. "Died during the war. Tuberculosis. Did she ever return to St. Mary Mead?" Francis hesitated. Not after Reginald's death. She blamed herself. Or perhaps she blamed someone else. Miss Marple met her gaze. "Did she send Christmas letters?" Francis flinched, ever so slightly. "I wouldn't know." The next morning, as the church bells rang in rehearsal once again, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the churchyard. Millie Parkins had met her there with trembling hands, and a voice just above a whisper. "I remembered something," she said. "I used to see a woman come into the tea-room, just before Christmas. Every year for 3 years, after the Major died, she'd sit alone and order clove tea, write a card, leave it sealed. To whom? I don't know. She never posted it, just left it in her book and walked away." "What did she look like?" "Quiet, pale, one green glove, one black. Said her name was Alice Miss Marple, drew a soft breath. Alice, Agatha, Annette. So many women, so many secrets hidden in plain sight. But one thing had become clear now. The missing Christmas letter, the one never posted, never claimed, was not just the key to solving Isabel's death. It had been meant for Reginald's killer. Back at home, Miss Marple placed all the pieces on her desk. The torn letter, the violet, the photo, the music fragment, the notes sent to her by mistake. Then at last, she opened the final envelope, the one she had hidden all this time. Inside was the real letter Isabel had written before her death. It had never been blank. It had simply been washed, dipped once in clove tea, smudging the ink but leaving a faint trace beneath. Miss Marple had dried it carefully. Now, in the fading light, she read the visible line once more. She came for the manuscript. I refused. I told her what I knew. I think she put something in my tea. Chapter 7. The wind had turned again. Sharper now. It came in sudden gusts that rattled shutters and flung grit against windows like urgent tapping fingers. Inside her small sitting room, Miss Marple lit a second lamp and laid the dried, tea-stained letter gently onto a clean sheet of white paper. Only a single sentence remained visible. She came for the manuscript. I refused. That line, faint though it was, carried weight far beyond the ink. Isabel Larkspur had known, and someone very much alive had been determined to silence her before she said too much. By noon, Miss Marple was knocking at the vestry door. The Reverend Clement welcomed her with his usual smile, though his eyes were tired. "Jane, what brings you on such a raw day?" She glanced toward the cluttered desk behind him. "I wonder if I might look at the church's memorial records, specifically Reginald Larkspur's funeral service." The vicar blinked, then nodded. "Of course. You'll find the ledgers in the top cabinet. Green spine, 1937. Miss Marple, methodical as ever, eased the heavy book from the shelf and flipped carefully to the December entries. There it was. Major Reginald Desmond Larkspur. Burial, December 21st, 1937. Reading selected by Miss Agatha Deering. "Ah," the vicar said quietly, peering over her shoulder. "That's right. She handled the service arrangements, a distant cousin if I recall. She vanished not long after that. Did she live in the village? Briefly. Stayed with the family while Mrs. Larkspur was recovering from grief. Miss Marple stared down at the name. Agatha Deering, A.D., the sender of the unsigned letter, the writer of the mysterious Christmas notes, the one who had vanished before anyone began asking real questions. But the trail hadn't gone entirely cold, because Miss Marple now had something Agatha never intended anyone to find. She returned home, laid out the manuscript fragments from Reginald's unfinished composition, The Silence of Snow, and set to reassembling them like a puzzle. The melody, though faded and incomplete, carried a distinct tone, melancholic, unsettling, and unresolved. It had been written after Annette's death, and beneath the final measures, Reginald had scrawled 5 words in small, desperate handwriting. To be revealed if I die. She exhaled softly. This manuscript had never been merely music. It had been a confession, a coded confession. That evening, she asked Inspector Crail to join her at the vicarage. Winifred Clement poured them tea, while Miss Marple explained quietly what she had discovered. Reginald suspected his wife had been poisoned. He couldn't prove it, but he encoded his suspicions in music. That's why Isabel refused to destroy the score. It was his final attempt at truth. Crail frowned. But why wait so long to reveal it? Because she feared retaliation. She was certain someone still watched her, and she was right. Miss Marple opened her handbag and drew out a second envelope, one the inspector had never seen before. This came to me anonymously. Inside was only a name, Agatha Deering, and a warning not to trust Isabel. It was an attempt to redirect me, cleverly but sloppily. Because in doing so, they revealed one thing. She looked up. Agatha Deering never left England. She simply changed her name. Crail sat forward. To what? Miss Marple's voice dropped. To Evelyn Hartley. The next morning, Evelyn Hartley stood at the front of the church, leading choir rehearsal as though nothing had changed. Her expression was brisk, her instructions sharp, but her eyes flicked twice toward the back pew, where Miss Marple sat knitting. After rehearsal, Miss Marple waited until the others had gone. Evelyn, she said softly, you never told me your full name was Agatha Evelyn Deering. Miss Hartley froze. You hid in plain sight, Miss Marple continued, changing your surname, teaching piano to the children of the same village where your cousin died. Evelyn said nothing. You came back after Reginald's death because you feared Isabel would unearth the truth. And when she finally did, you brewed her one last cup of clove tea. Evelyn turned slowly. Her voice, when it came, was flat. She was going to destroy everything he'd created. That manuscript was the last thing he gave to me. Not to her. He never loved her. He mourned Annette, and he knew. You could have let it end, Miss Marple said gently. I tried to, Evelyn snapped. But Isabel couldn't let the past lie. She sniffed at ghosts and stirred up guilt. That letter, she said she was going to show it to Francis, and then the police. I panicked. She trembled now, just faintly. I thought if she died quietly, without drama, it could all be buried again like before. Miss Marple's face was calm. But nothing stays buried forever, not in St. Mary Mead. Evelyn Hartley was taken away quietly that evening. She offered no struggle. Only one request, that the music Reginald had written be played at Christmas Mass. Miss Marple standing in the church aisle as the organist rehearsed the haunting melody, nodded once. Let it be played, she thought. Let the silence speak at last. Chapter 8. Word of Evelyn Hartley's arrest moved through St. Mary Mead not like a storm, but like mist, quiet, clinging, and slow to lift. By the following morning, the village knew everything and nothing all at once. There were whispers at the baker's, silence at the tea-room, and puzzled glances at the church gate. Miss Marple, however, remained unobtrusive. She tended her garden, wrote a modest letter to her niece in Bournemouth, and declined a polite but pointed inquiry from the St. Mary Mead Gazette editor. "It isn't my story to tell," she said mildly. But in truth, she was not yet finished. On the day before Christmas Eve, Inspector Crail returned to Larkspur House with a constable in tow. Miss Marple met them there, having requested one final visit before the estate was sealed for probate. "I believe there's something more," she said. "Something Evelyn, or rather Agatha, left behind deliberately. Not to incriminate herself, but as justification." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You believe she wanted to be found out?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I believe she wanted to be understood." They entered Reginald's study, which had remained largely undisturbed since his death. The air was cold, the scent faintly medicinal. Miss Marple moved to the shelf beside the fireplace and ran her fingers along a row of untouched books, then paused. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. Crail tilted his head. A faint hum. Not electrical, something subtler. Miss Marple pulled down a dusty volume of Byron's letters and journals, revealing a thin wire. She tugged. A section of the bookcase slid inward with a sigh. Behind it, a shallow niche, no wider than a bread box. Inside lay a slim velvet folder. Miss Marple opened it. A score, The Silence of Snow, fully complete, annotated in Reginald's own hand. And tucked beneath it, a letter dated the week before his death. "To whoever finds this, I can no longer carry what I know. Annette died not from illness, but by misdose. It was no accident. She suspected it herself in her final weeks, and I did nothing. I was afraid of scandal, of consequence, of facing the truth about someone I trusted. Agatha was with us then. She had access to everything. She was fond of me, too fond. When Annette fell ill, I begged her to leave, but she wouldn't. Now Isabel asks questions, and Agatha grows anxious. If I am gone, let this be heard. In the music, I wrote it plainly. Listen to the fall of the melody. The last note is Annette's name, RDL. Inspector Crail stared at the letter, then slowly exhaled. So he knew. Miss Marple nodded. And Isabel found this, or at least part of it. That's why she refused to give Evelyn the manuscript. And that's why she died. Crail turned to her. How did Evelyn believe this would end? Did she really think no one would ever trace it back? She didn't care, Miss Marple replied. Once Isabel started digging, it was all too close. She panicked, but even then she left the music intact. Perhaps a part of her still believed she was protecting Reginald. Crail folded the letter carefully. Tragic, really. She didn't kill out of hatred. No, said Miss Marple. She killed out of fear. And fear, Inspector, is a most irrational thing. On Christmas Eve, the village gathered in the candlelit church for the late carol service. The scandal was fresh in everyone's mind, but it was Christmas, and Christmas demanded decorum, no matter the gossip behind gloved hands. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her lap rug tucked neatly over her knees. The choir sang, Hark, the herald angels sing. The vicar spoke with appropriate solemnity, and then came the organist's hesitant announcement. A special request, a piece titled The Silence of Snow, composed by the late Major Reginald Larkspur. The melody began quietly, fragile and slow, with descending notes like melting frost. Midway, it climbed, then faltered, and descended again in eerie echoing steps. It was beautiful, it was mournful, it was a confession in chords. And in the final bars, as Miss Marple listened with folded hands, she heard it. The whisper of Annette's name, spelled softly in notes, fading into stillness. The congregation applauded gently, not quite sure why. But Miss Marple understood. It was the last message of a man who'd stayed silent too long, and the final judgment upon a woman who had loved too much, too wrongly. After the service, Miss Marple walked home alone. Snow had begun to fall again, not heavily, but in soft, persistent flakes. She paused once beneath the gaslight near the vicarage and looked up. The village was quiet again. No more locked drawers, no more teacups laced with silence. But she knew better than to believe the peace would last. People, she thought, are very much like Christmas letters, seemingly cheerful on the outside, but often written to hide the truth. Still, the truth had come to light this time. The story was complete, even if some would rather it had remained untold. Chapter 9. Christmas Day dawned cold but bright in St. Mary Mead. A pale sun hovered just above the treetops, painting the frost-laced lanes with a faint golden shimmer. The village moved more slowly than usual, not because of the chill, but out of a subdued politeness, mourning, in its own discreet way, what had come to light. Evelyn Hartley's house remained shuttered. Her arrest had shocked many, confused more, and prompted much whispered reinterpretation of old choir rehearsals and tea-room conversations. How strange, they now said, that someone so proper had such darkness folded inside her. But Miss Marple, as always, understood better than most. Murder, she often said, was never born in grand gestures. It grew in quiet corners. That morning, the vicarage held its modest annual Christmas breakfast, and Miss Marple, true to form, arrived precisely on time with a wrapped jar of orange marmalade and a copy of Northanger Abbey for Winifred Clement. Over scones and black-currant jam, the conversation drifted from hymns to hymnal thefts. Someone had taken one from Pew 7, apparently, before landing softly on the subject that hadn't quite settled. "I suppose," Winifred said, "we were all rather blind about Evelyn." "She hid well," Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea. "Loneliness makes some people very clever." "Do you believe she regretted it? What she did?" "Yes," said Miss Marple simply, "but regret doesn't undo murder." The room fell quiet. Then the vicar cleared his throat. "The manuscript, the music, it was quite haunting." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the frost-gilded cemetery. It was meant to be. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to Larkspur House for the final time. Inspector Crail had granted her 1 hour before the property was turned over to the estate solicitor. Francis Larkspur, having inherited by default, had taken up residence in a hotel in Bath and seemed unlikely to return. The house felt different now, emptier, quieter, stripped of its illusions. She climbed the stairs to the late Isabel's bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and retrieved a small cloth-bound notebook tucked between a scarf and a hat-box. She had noticed it weeks earlier, but left it untouched until now. Inside were lines of uneven handwriting, journal entries interspersed with clipped newspaper articles and lists of dates. One entry stood out, written only weeks before Isabel's death. Reginald's silence weighs on me still. Evelyn grows tense. She asks questions she never used to. I found her near the piano room yesterday, pretending to dust. She's looking for it, the letter, or the music, perhaps both. And below it, in smaller, fainter ink, I must speak to someone. But who? Francis would call me hysterical. And the village cannot be trusted with secrets. Perhaps Miss Marple? Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. She had been too late. That evening, as the village lights flickered on and families gathered around modest suppers, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, forwarded from the Edinburgh address of Anna Duncombe. It was a short reply, dated 2 days after the original had been posted. Dear Miss Marple, I'm sorry I didn't respond sooner. Your query startled me. Yes, I was a maid at Larkspur House, but only briefly. What I saw in those days still troubles me. Quiet things, like glances never meant to be witnessed, and words dropped in corridors. I do believe something happened to Mrs. Annette. She was ill, but not naturally. I said nothing then. I was young. But when I heard Reginald had died too, I knew something was wrong. If I could have helped Mrs. Larkspur, I would have. But sometimes people don't want help. They want silence. I hope you found the truth anyway. Yours sincerely, Anna Duncombe. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it beside the others. Another voice in the quiet choir of guilt and memory. Another piece of a puzzle that had long since ended in tragedy. On Boxing Day, she received one final visitor, Millie Parkins from the tea room. She arrived red-cheeked and breathless, with a small tin in her hands. I thought you'd like a slice of the Christmas cake, Miss Marple. No brandy in this one. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Very thoughtful, my dear. Millie lingered a moment, eyes flicking to the stack of papers on the table. It's really over, isn't it? She asked. The whole terrible business. Yes, Miss Marple said. It's over. But it doesn't feel like it. Not really. Miss Marple looked toward the hearth. Because stories don't end when the last word is spoken, Millie. They end when people stop needing them. The girl nodded slowly, then turned to go. At the door, she hesitated. Do you think she, Evelyn, ever truly loved him? Major Larkspur? Miss Marple looked up. I think she loved a version of him that never existed, and she tried to preserve that version, no matter the cost. Millie blinked. Is that still love? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. No, dear, that's fear wearing love's clothing. That night, the village slept soundly under a clear sky. The snow had melted into a glaze of frost that shimmered beneath the moonlight. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple penned the final lines of her own letter, to her niece, to the police, to no one in particular. Justice came quietly this time. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confessions, no final shouts across candlelit drawing rooms. Only the slow unveiling of things too long kept hidden. A woman loved a man who did not love her. Another woman died for it. And yet another carried the guilt like a poison, passing it along until it killed again. There was music, and there was silence. And in between, the truth. Merry Christmas, if such things can still be said in a village like ours. Yours affectionately, J.M. Chapter 10. New Year's Eve arrived in St. Mary Mead without fanfare. No fireworks, no parties, just a pale winter moon and the rustling hush of wind through bare branches. The village, still recovering from the shock of Evelyn Hartley's arrest, and the secrets uncovered at Larkspur House had slipped into a hush that felt more like contemplation than celebration. Miss Marple spent the morning writing thank-you notes and retying the ribbons on returned books from the lending library. All the while, her thoughts drifted back, replaying moments, glances, words spoken too softly to be noticed by others, but lodged clearly in her memory. She was not finished. There was one detail, small but persistent, that continued to trouble her, and it had to do with Frances Larkspur. Frances had removed herself entirely from village life since Isabel's death, retreating to a private hotel in Bath. She had given a statement, signed the necessary papers, and made no further comment. But something about her silence, its perfection, still echoed unnaturally. Miss Marple did not believe Frances Larkspur had killed Isabel, but she did believe Frances had known it was going to happen. Inspector Crail met Miss Marple at the station platform 2 days later. He had received her note, brief and unassuming, asking for an escort to Bath. "I thought we had our culprit," he said, coat collar turned up against the wind. "We do," Miss Marple replied, "but we haven't accounted for the accomplice." Crail frowned. "You think Frances helped Evelyn?" "Not directly. But she did something far worse. She let it happen." Frances Larkspur received them in the hotel lounge, her manner composed, her voice clipped. "I assume this isn't a social call," she said, eyes moving between them. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but it is a necessary one." Frances sat straight-backed, a thin veil of irritation behind her politeness. Miss Marple placed a small envelope on the table. It was unsealed. "You recognize that, I imagine." Frances didn't touch it. "One of Isabel's." "No," Miss Marple said. "One of yours, sent anonymously to me. It warned me not to trust Isabel and mentioned a date, December 18th, the day Isabel received the fatal letter." Frances blinked. "You think I wrote it?" "I know you did." Inspector Crail shifted forward in his seat. Miss Marple traced the paper to a small shop in Tunbridge Wells. The ink, custom mixed, sold only to 5 clients in the region. Your name was on the ledger. Frances didn't flinch. Miss Marple continued, gently but firmly. "You didn't kill Isabel, but you knew Evelyn would, or suspected it. And instead of stopping her, you ensured the blame would shift." Frances let out a slow breath. "You can't prove that." "I don't need to," Miss Marple replied. "Your letter is proof enough of your intent. You didn't commit the murder, but you facilitated the silence that made it possible. And that, Miss Larkspur, is something your cousin Isabel anticipated, which is why she left a second letter." Frances stiffened. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She wrote more than one. One for me, one for you." Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple opened the safe at the vicarage, a favour granted quietly by Reverend Clement. Inside, amid dull silver communion items and a faded wedding register, sat a second envelope, addressed simply, "To be given to Miss Frances Larkspur if anything should happen to me. I.L." Inspector Crail read it silently, his brow furrowing. "Frances, if you're reading this, I am gone, whether by Evelyn's hand or your silence. It matters little now. But know that I saw through both of you. You wore disapproval like perfume. I think you hated me for having what you couldn't claim. Reginald's name, his house, his music. But you never had his trust. He told me the truth in the end. He wanted peace, not legacy. That was always your mistake. You wanted to preserve him. I just wanted him to rest. Enjoy what's left, Frances. But remember this, truth always finds a voice, even in silence." Isabel Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Isabel didn't fear Evelyn in the end. She pitied her, but she feared you. Crail tucked the letter into an evidence pouch. We'll pursue obstruction charges, possibly conspiracy. Frances Larkspur said nothing, but the look in her eyes said everything. A week later, as the snow melted and the village began to breathe again, Miss Marple received a visit from Timothy Purvis, the young post office clerk. "I forgot to mention this earlier, miss," he said, sheepishly holding out a folded sheet. "There was a second page to that torn letter we found. It slipped under the drawer lining." Miss Marple took it gently, eyes scanning the faded ink. It was in Isabel's handwriting. "I always thought the letter would arrive too late, that no one would hear it. But perhaps Jane Marple will. She sees the things others don't. If you're reading this, Jane, thank you. I hope you made the music speak for him." And for me, Miss Marple folded the page slowly, pressing her fingers to the words she had. Chapter 11. The first week of January in St. Mary Mead passed beneath pewter skies and a biting east wind. The bells of the parish church rang with a dull, hollow sound, muffled by mist and thawing frost. Life, it seemed, was returning to its ordinary rhythm. Afternoon deliveries, familiar gossip at the grocer's, steam rising from cottage chimneys. But beneath the surface, the village had changed. Evelyn Hartley's name was now spoken only in hushed tones. Frances Larkspur's departure to face legal proceedings had unsettled even the most sceptical gossips. And Larkspur House, once a place of distant glamour and inherited decorum, now stood cold and uninhabited, its secrets finally laid bare. In the centre of it all, quietly as ever, moved Miss Marple. She returned from the post office that Thursday morning with a letter in hand, one postmarked from Bath. It was addressed to her in a neat, unfamiliar script. She opened it slowly. "Miss Marple, I write not to protest but to confess what I could not say aloud. You are right. I sent the letter that turned your eyes toward Isabel. I watched Evelyn's unease grow, and I waited, not out of cruelty, but cowardice. I wanted the truth to emerge, but not from me. Reginald was everything I admired, and I never forgave him for choosing women like Annette and Isabel over someone like me. You may see that as vanity. But it was grief, too. I buried it deep, and when it resurfaced, when Isabel began looking, I let the tide carry her away. I merely stood on the shore. Do with this letter what you will." Frances Larkspur, Miss Marple, folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her desk drawer, not with the other evidence, but with her personal collection of unresolved endings and faded truths. Not every story needed to be shouted to the world. Some confessions were meant only to be heard. That afternoon, Reverend Clement invited Miss Marple to the vicarage for tea and a quiet conversation. The fire was warm, and Winifred's sponge cake unusually light. "I've been thinking," the vicar began, "about that music, the silence of snow. It's lingered with me longer than I expected." "As it should," Miss Marple replied. "It was never just a melody. It was an apology." He nodded solemnly. "But not Evelyn's." "No," she said, "Reginald's." The vicar hesitated. "You believe he knew then?" "I believe he suspected, and did nothing. Guilt, Mr. Clement, can rot quietly inside a man until it becomes unbearable." He stirred his tea. "But music isn't justice." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But sometimes it's the closest a man can come to telling the truth, without saying the words." Later, walking back through the churchyard, Miss Marple paused beside the Larkspur headstones once more. The frost had lifted. Moss crept up the corners of the oldest stones, and a few brave snowdrops had begun pushing their heads through the soil. 3 names lay carved there still: Annette, Reginald, Isabel, all 3 bound by silence, all 3 betrayed in different ways by those closest to them. Miss Marple bent slightly and laid a single violet on Annette's grave. "Your name deserved to be remembered," she whispered. And then she walked on. At the tea-room, Millie Parkins had returned to her usual chatter, though her eyes now carried the faint look of someone who'd stared too long into other people's grief. She greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile. "Ginger's gone today." "Please," Millie lowered her voice, "I heard the Larkspur estate is being sold to a couple from London. Architects want to turn it into some sort of retreat." "How modern," Miss Marple murmured. "They said they like the bones of it," Millie added, "and that the past doesn't scare them." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Let's hope they understand what it means to live with ghosts." Back at home, Miss Marple tidied her desk, placing the last few letters and newspaper clippings into a small manila folder marked simply Larkspur Case. She had no desire to reread it any time soon, but she would not destroy it either. She looked at the clock, 4:55 p.m., just time to light the lamp and settle in for one final thought. Because there was something Evelyn Hartley had never answered. Not in confession, not in silence. And that was this. Why now? Why, after all those years, did she finally act? The answer, Miss Marple had come to suspect, was hidden not in violence, but in envy. She had watched Isabel age gracefully, move on, laugh again, even reach out to others for companionship. Evelyn, in contrast, had only preserved her grief, cloaked it in duty, masked it in rehearsals, steeped it in propriety. And when Isabel dared disturb the past, Evelyn shattered. The music was only the final straw. It had always been about control. And when Evelyn lost that, she did the one thing she swore she never would. She killed the woman who had moved on. Outside, snow began to fall once more, not heavy, but delicate. A fresh sheet upon the village. Miss Marple placed her teacup on its saucer. The mystery was complete, but the people remained. Chapter 12. The snow lingered into January's second week, softer now, no longer falling in sharp gusts, but drifting gently across the cobbled lanes and hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. The village, shaken into quiet reflection by the events surrounding the Larkspur affair, had resumed its gentle routines, but with a changed rhythm, like a clock slightly out of time. It was not that people spoke of Evelyn Hartley or Frances Larkspur often, quite the opposite. Their names were tucked carefully away behind polite smiles and cautious teacups, as if saying them aloud might wake something. But Miss Marple knew better. The truth had already been awakened. And now it was time to lay it to rest. On the morning of January 10th, a letter arrived bearing a French stamp and an unfamiliar name. Inside was a modest note, written in careful English. "Dear Miss Marple, I am writing on behalf of my aunt, Anna Duncombe, who passed away peacefully last week. Among her belongings was a box marked England, containing a stack of letters, one addressed to you. She had intended to send it, but never found the courage. She often spoke of St. Mary Mead, and of the regrets she carried. Thank you for helping her remember she was not wrong to suspect what she saw. With gratitude, Claire Beaulieu enclosed was the letter Anna had never posted. Miss Marple, you may not remember me, but I remember you. You were always watching even then. I should have spoken long ago. I was the one who found Annette's medicine bottle that week, the one with the altered label. I took it to Reginald. He told me not to speak of it again. I think he knew then, and simply couldn't bear the truth. Evelyn frightened me, not with violence, but with silence. She watched people too, but she never saw them the way you do. I hope, if you ever read this, you've managed what none of us could, to let the dead speak without shame. Yours in sorrow, Anna Duncombe. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she placed it gently beside her tea and folded her hands in thought. It was not a revelation. It confirmed what she had already known. But it was something else. A final note, a soft closing chord that allowed the music of the case to end with dignity. That afternoon, Inspector Crail came to visit, not for official business, but for tea. The fire was lit, and Miss Marple had baked almond biscuits. Crail looked older than usual, wearier. "I just came from Evelyn," he said, setting down his cup. "She's been transferred to a quiet facility. She isn't speaking." Miss Marple nodded. "She said all she had to say. The rest will remain inside." Crail paused. "Do you think she'll ever confess publicly?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "But she already confessed in the only way that mattered. She left the manuscript intact." Crail exhaled. "And Frances?" "She'll face a lesser charge. Obstruction. She's already fading into obscurity, which I believe suits her perfectly." He gave a small smile. "You know, for all the drama, it's strange how calm the ending has been." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That's the way of real tragedies, Inspector. They don't end in fireworks, they end in snow." The next Sunday, the church held a memorial service for the departed members of the Larkspur family. It was not heavily attended. Only those few with long memories and quiet forgiveness in their hearts. Miss Marple sat in the third pew, listening as the organ played The Silence of Snow one final time. It sounded different now, less haunting, more sorrowful. Not an accusation, but an elegy. After the final hymn, Reverend Clement addressed the few gathered. "Today we remember not only the lives lost, but the silence broken. May we learn from what has passed. May truth not always arrive too late." No one spoke, but heads bowed, and for a moment, even the draught in the old stone walls seemed to still. Miss Marple walked home through the long village lane. Her boots crunched faintly on salted gravel. From a distance, she could hear the faint bleating of sheep and the far-off whistle of the 3:15 to Paddington. Life moved on. At her gate, she paused to watch a robin hop along the garden wall. Then, stepping inside, she took one final item from her bureau drawer. The last note written by Isabel Larkspur. Not the letter, not the smudged warning. A card, small, hand-penned, and addressed in looping script, to Miss Marple with thanks. "You listened even before I spoke. May we all be heard in time. Yours sincerely, I'll." Miss Marple smiled faintly and placed it into her keepsake box, alongside letters from other long-closed cases. Then she closed the lid. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clearing. And somewhere in the village, a new melody began, simple, quiet, and untouched by the past. Chapter 13. The days grew longer, but the chill of winter lingered stubbornly over St. Mary Mead. The village had settled into a new kind of stillness, one heavier than the frost that clung to window panes, and the late snowdrops nodding by garden walls. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair, the late afternoon sun filtering through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns on her knitting basket. The Larkspur case, with all its layered secrets and silent tragedies, was at last complete, its last notes played and its final truths told. And yet, the quiet that followed was not relief, but contemplation. the village had changed. At the tea room, Millie Parkins served gingerbread with a smile now tempered by understanding. She had seen how grief and regret could wrap themselves around a person like a second skin. At the church, Reverend Clement spoke softly of forgiveness and the heavy burdens of secrecy, urging the congregation to remember the frailty of human nature, even in those who had erred grievously. The Larkspur estate had been sold to a young couple from London, who promised to restore the house with care, while honouring the history it held, its shadows as well as its light. Miss Marple's mind returned often to the women caught in the web of the past. Annette, the first wife, delicate and fading. Isabel, steadfast and brave. Evelyn, who had been both victim and perpetrator. And Francis, the silent watcher who had let darkness grow. They were, in their ways, reflections of the village itself, each harbouring desires, disappointments and fears beneath genteel surfaces. Miss Marple pondered the enduring nature of such human frailty, how easily love could twist into something unrecognisable, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always found its voice eventually. One evening, as the village prepared to welcome the first tentative buds of spring, Miss Marple was visited by Inspector Crail. They sat by the fire, drinking tea that was a little too strong, and discussing the outcome. "It was a quiet conclusion," Crail remarked. "No dramatic arrests, no sudden confessions, just the slow unfolding of years-old pain." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "justice is often less about punishment and more about unveiling. And healing, if it can be had." Crail nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think the village will ever fully recover?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Recovery is a journey, Inspector. The scars remain, but so does the wisdom to avoid making the same mistakes again. If we're lucky." That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the stars twinkle over the sleeping village. Her thoughts turned to the letters, the music, and the quiet courage of those who sought the truth despite fear. She knew that human nature, with its follies and failings, would always repeat its patterns somewhere, sometime. But she also knew that light could reach even the darkest corners, sometimes in a whispered melody, sometimes in a carefully folded letter, and sometimes in the gentle patience of a village spinster who noticed the smallest details and listened to the unspoken. The fire dwindled to embers, and Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, content that this story, like so many others, had found its end. The village, too, could move forward now, scarred but whole, carrying the lessons of the missing Christmas letter in its heart.